Nothing could have prepared me for what happened. Not the hundreds of hours of classroom learning. All the practical training exercises in the world were for nothing. A squadron of fighter jets might have stood a chance, but I doubt it. I encountered an unstoppable force of nature 6 years ago, like a tsunami or a volcano eruption. If you're caught in its path, you're done for. Lucky for me, I survived. It was sheer luck that I did. This is a warning. Stay out of Yosemite National Park. 6 years ago, I was a mounted patrol ranger. On that day, Buckley, my horse, and I were out on patrol near Tuolumne Meadows when I noticed a man approaching us in the distance. He waved his arms at us frantically and collapsed to the ground. He clutched his chest, struggling to catch his breath. His mouth was wide open as he gasped for air. I thought that he might have been having an asthma attack. I immediately noticed blood on his shirt as we came closer, but he didn't appear to be wounded. He cried out for help as I jumped off Buckley and went to see if there was anything that I could do while I radioed for medical assistance. Before he could catch his breath, the man incoherently told me something about his son being injured and something about a tour group. I told him to concentrate on catching his breath so he could tell me what was happening clearly. Once he could speak, he introduced himself as Greg and told me what happened with this tour group. Honestly, I couldn't believe it until I had experienced it for myself. He said they had been on a guided tour in the woods nearby, and everything was fine until there was a series of explosions among the tour group. Greg said that his son's cell phone had exploded in his pocket, and his wife's digital camera had blown to pieces inside the carrying case. Everyone's electronic devices had blown, including the tour guide's radio. He also mentioned that a man had collapsed on the spot and remained unresponsive. Of course, his main concern was for his son. He said that shards from the phone were lodged in his leg, and he had suffered serious burns. They tried to tend to the wounds before he came running for help. I relayed the information back to base, requesting medical assistance on my position once Greg led me back to the injured group. While I didn't like to ride double on Buckley, time was of the essence. Greg was far too exhausted to continue on foot. The tour group couldn't have been too far away anyway if he had made it to me. Buckley could handle the weight, and we needed to get there as soon as possible. He likely would have died of a heart attack if I hadn't given him a ride. Perhaps that would have been a mercy compared to how he died later. We rode alongside the stream, heading directly for the tree line in the distance. The path was familiar, a popular destination for a moderate hike. Greg showed me where to go. As we came closer to the trees, I felt a rising warmth on my side, exactly where my radio was attached to my belt. Remembering what Greg had told me earlier about the electronics, I immediately reached down and removed the radio from my holster. It felt like it had been left out under the sun for hours. It was so hot that it burned the palm of my hand, and I dropped it to the side. Upon hitting the ground, it sparked before it exploded. Buckley got startled at the sound and he barked. I comforted him as best as I could while charging ahead. The further into the woods that we went, Buckley became more agitated. He barked hard, nearly tossing Greg and me off of him. It wasn't like Buckley to not follow commands. He had been trained for service since he was a colt. The further I tried to force him to continue, the more he fought until I decided to leave him behind. Buckley fought like crazy when I tried to tie him to a tree. There wasn't much that I could do against the horse if he was dead set on leaving. In a last-ditch effort, I tried to pull him, and the reins had slipped from my hand. Buckley turned back in the direction that we had come from and disappeared into the woods. He had run back to the stable like he was trained to do. Admittedly, this left me feeling shaken. As we trekked on through the woods, Greg asked if I had any ideas on what was happening, and I didn't have an answer for him. Buckley getting spooked, I could understand. Something unnerved him. Greg and I couldn't sense it, but Buckley could feel it from the moment that we had entered those woods. Exploding electronics wasn't something that we were taught about in training. As I said earlier, nothing in the world could have prepared me for what came that day. Nothing. When I made myself known, I was immediately ambushed by several tourists. They all spoke at once, requesting help for their loved ones. Being swarmed by everyone asking questions and pleading for assistance didn't help with the situation. Most of the uninjured sustained burns and lacerations from what I could see. What really worried me was the unresponsive man Greg had mentioned earlier. Through the crowd, I saw a woman sitting off to the side with a 1,000-yard stare in her eyes. She sat against a tree alone, next to a heavy-set man face down on the ground. I insisted on attending to the man who clearly wasn't moving or showing any signs of life. From what I could tell, he wasn't even breathing. I ran over to the man and checked for a pulse while asking his companion if she felt okay. She didn't respond, and I could see why. There was no pulse. The man was dead. Falling back on my training, I immediately went to start chest compressions. I reached underneath the man's side to flip him over, and my hands were immediately met with warmth and wetness. When I turned him over, I immediately jumped in surprise. My hands were covered in blood. The entire left side of the man's upper body was missing. Pieces of wire and metal surrounded the mangled meat of the wound. At the confirmation that her companion was indeed dead, the woman wailed so loudly that everyone turned their attention to her. She said only one word between her sobs and screams, which I understood. Pacemaker. Seeing a casualty, I called out for someone to hand me something to cover the man's face. No one moved or made a noise aside from the woman grieving her dead companion. It was here that I noticed the absolute silence surrounding us. Usually, there are signs of life all around us making noise. Birds chirping, bugs buzzing, frogs croaking. I realized that we were in more danger than we knew. It was silent around us because the animals had either run away, as Buckley had, or they remained quiet to hide from what had scared them. Whatever was happening, we needed to get everyone out of the woods quickly. I commanded the non-injured to assist the wounded and help them start walking out of the woods. One of the women in the group immediately asked why I didn't just radio for help, and I told her that my radio had blown, and we needed to get out of here as soon as possible. If you've ever done anything in life with a group of people, you'll understand that getting them to follow directions is nearly impossible. One person wants to fight back on anything you tell them because they don't respect authority. Another person yells at that person to comply, and those two start a fight. You have another person who starts doing their own thing, and you have others following them. And groups split off into other groups and do whatever they want. In this case, we didn't even get the chance to start fighting with each other. As I tried to get everyone moving, a blast of lightning ripped across a blackening sky above us. It struck a tree only a few hundred yards away, and then the wind picked up, lifting leaves and dust and debris through the air. The weather report for the week was clear, sunny skies with no chance of precipitation. This development unnerved me as I looked up at the clouds overhead and saw how deeply dark and ominous and out of place and alien these clouds were in the sky. Buried somewhere within the primitive part of my brain, I recognized something was amiss in this isolated pocket of our world. It must have hit the others in the group as well, as some of them stopped and stared into the sky, petrified and frozen in place, awaiting their demise. Others rushed to grab their loved ones and drag them to safety. and still others abandoned the group in utter terror, with nothing but the instinct of self-preservation dominating the otherwise civilized and evolved parts of their being. What comes next, I still see it whenever it storms. First, another eruption of lightning tore the sky asunder, nearly deafening me with its turbulent force. Then, in the electrical firebolt streaking across the sky, I saw the silhouette of a massive, winged creature flying through the air. Each thrust of its colossal wings produced bolts of lightning, crackling across the sky in all directions. I was glued to the spot, staring up at it through the tops of trees and branches in awe. As the creature circled the sky above, with each flash and crackle of lightning, the sky filled with smaller versions of the beast surrounding their brood mother. This is what had spooked Buckley and all the other animals. They knew this creature was coming and they ran for their lives. Our exploding electronics were our warning. Nothing as deep-seated as animal instinct, but a warning nonetheless. After witnessing this, I am ashamed to admit that I gave in to the part of me hell-bent on self-preservation, and I started to run away from the woods. But unfortunately, many others had already run away, leaving behind those who tried to help their injured friends and family. If I had tried to help anyone, I would have likely joined them in death. As I ran into the woods, I saw someone running in front of me rise into the air, as if the invisible hand of God had plucked them from the ground. There wasn't any time to process what I had seen when I felt a sudden lurch beneath my feet, and then I too was airborne. My first crazed thought was to assume one of these creatures had swept me off the ground. However, as the world spun, I realized nothing held on to me. Instinctively, I reached out and tried to take a hold of the tree branch, but I couldn't get a grasp as they slipped through my hands, and I went further into the air. This happened at least a dozen more times until I finally grabbed a hold tightly to a branch and managed to pull myself to the trunk. I still felt a force of being pulled upward as I held on, and didn't let go until the whole thing was over and the creatures were gone. But I'm jumping ahead here. From my position, I had a clear view of what was happening. The others hadn't been as lucky as I was. They continued to float into the air, spinning around, screaming, and reaching out like a doomed astronaut untethered and floating into the vastness of outer space. It wasn't only the people either. There were deer, birds, and several other animals caught in the same trap. All of them floated through the air, high above the trees, and stopped their heavenly ascent at the same point. With one final screech from the brood mother, the smaller creatures circled through the air once and then swooped down to enjoy their meal. Humans, animals, insects, whatever managed to float to that invisible line in the sky was consumed. The sound of their screeches and squawks masked the screams. I turned my head away, holding it against the tree and tightening my grip on the tree trunk for dear life. I didn't know if these creatures would notice one of their snacks had gone missing. Maybe they would sweep down into the trees and I'd be done for. But of course they didn't. I cannot guess how long I stayed in the tree, but once these screeches and squawks had stopped, I no longer heard any screams, and gravity felt as if it had returned, and I braved to look to the sky. It was clear of any monsters or dark, calamitous clouds. Nothing or no one floated in the air against the laws of gravity. The setting sun of dusk returned to its rightful place, dominating the sky and extinguishing the last remnants of light in the day. All had returned to normal except for my state of mind. I climbed on the tree, slowly and steadily as my muscles ached. Once I had reached the ground, I sat down and allowed myself to rest. My mind was reeling, my body was thrashed. I closed my eyes for what felt like a minute or two and awakened to a paramedic shaking me. Moments later, I was carted off in an ambulance and treated for wounds that I had sustained while climbing down from the tree. There were tons of questions as to what happened afterward. The whole incident was chalked up to a random freak tornado happening in that area, and the tour group was wiped out in the resulting storm. According to authorities on the scene, there were dark clouds over that section of the woods, and they saw a massive cone touch down. As far as I was concerned, I let them tell whatever story they wanted to make it all go away. It's not like anyone would believe me anyway. Not long after the incident, I decided to quit being a park ranger and I moved to Philadelphia to live with some family for a while before getting back on my feet again. I couldn't stand the thought of being in the forest anymore after seeing what I saw. So when it storms, I run for cover indoors and stay away from windows. I drown myself in alcohol, then take a few extra Xanax to avoid the inevitable thoughts that creep into my mind at night before going to sleep. But in my nightmares, I'm always back to Yosemite. Buckley and I are on patrol, and we see Greg coming towards us in need of help.